Poetic Diction by Owen Barfield. Chapter 2. The Effects of Poetry, Pleasure and Knowledge. 1. In examples 2 to 6, one of the most efficient causes of pleasure is, palpably, sound, the rhythm, the music, and the manner in which rhythm and music are wedded to sense. The sound of language is crucially relevant to its poetic meaning. Indeed, owing to the peculiar relation of the vocal organs to the rest of the body, it is relevant even to those correspondences which will be considered later under the heading of metaphor. It has a bearing, too, on the essentially active nature of the poetic consciousness, which is one of the findings of this book. But the subject is an extremely subtle and delicate one, and, thanks to the changes of form which words undergo in the course of their history, is particularly difficult to discuss theoretically and illustrate with examples. Though they may be indistinguishable in practice, topically it is possible to distinguish the intellectual element in poetic meaning from the tonal, and where there is more than one topic, it is reasonable to deal with one at a time. Accordingly, I have, for the purpose of this book, considered sound as lying outside the province of poetic diction, properly so called, and it will not be further discussed. 2. When I try to describe in more detail than by the phrase aesthetic imagination what experience it is to which at some time or other I have been led, and at any time may be led again, by all of these examples I find myself obliged to define it as a felt change of consciousness, where consciousness embraces all my awareness of my surroundings at any given moment, and surroundings includes my own feelings. By felt, I mean to signify that the change itself is noticed or attended to. To take the simplest example, Number 1, when I, as European adult, actually observe or visualize a three-masted screw steamer with two funnels, the manner in which I immediately experience my surroundings, the meaning which they have for me, is determined by the various concepts which I have learnt, since my childhood, to unite with the percept, or complex of percepts underlying the phenomenon in question. By percept I mean that element in my experience which in no way depends on my own mental activity, present or past, the pure sense datum. The concepts likely to be operative in this case are reflected in such English words as mast, mechanical propulsion, steam, coal, smoke, chimney for smoke to escape by, etc., all of which are summed up and, as it were, fused in my own peculiar and habitual idea of steamer. It is this idea which determines for me the quality or meaning of my immediate experience in observation. Now, when I read the words 3 bamboo, 2 puff, walking along inside, no can see, I am for a moment transported into a totally different kind of consciousness. I see the steamer not through my own eyes, but through the eyes of a primitive South Sea Islander. His experience, his meaning, is quite different from mine, for it is the product of quite different concepts. This he reveals by his choice of words, and the result is that for a moment I shed Western civilization like an old garment and behold my steamer in a new and strange light. 3. Without reducing our definition of poetic diction to an absurdity, we can hardly maintain that this particular example, number 1, would be poetic to the South Sea Islanders themselves. On the contrary, we may safely suppose it to be felt there as a part of the business jargon of every day. Footnote: Pigeon is in fact said to be the Chinese version of the English word business. It is thus a particularly clear-cut example of the fact, referred to in Chapter 1, that a given group of words may be a vehicle of poetry to one individual or group of individuals and not to another. It may, for instance, be unpoetic to the consciousness which originates it, but poetic to the consciousness which receives or contemplates it. This is an aspect of poetic diction to which I shall have to return later. From this it follows that the extent to which the selection and arrangement of words is due to a consciously creative effort, art, on the part of some one human being, poet, varies as between the 6 examples. The range of variation must probably remain a matter of dispute, but it would be at any rate arguable that it is from 0 in the first example up to 80 or 90% in the last 2. Obviously, this percentage can never rise to 100, because even the most original poet is obliged to work with words, and words, unlike marble or pigment or vibrations in the air, owe their very substance, meaning, to the generations of human beings who have previously used them. No poet, therefore, can be the creator of all the meaning in his poem. The point will be made plainer by taking an intermediate example. Consider number 2. there is no need to enter into the old question of the communal origin of ballads, for however pronounced may be the stamp of individual genius in the best English ballads, it still remains indisputable that they have in common certain turns of expression, certain tricks of meter and repetition and narrative, and that, while on the one hand these cannot all be due to the genius of one single man, on the other hand they do undoubtedly contribute to the poetic quality of the diction of the ballad. Thus, if I wish to be especially critical, I can divide my enjoyment of a ballad into two parts. I enjoy it as ballad, and I enjoy it as poem. This fact comes out very clearly if I read a great number of ballads one after the other. For then, in time, the ballad quality ceases to arouse my aesthetic imagination at all, and I depend wholly on the individual quality of the one particular example I am reading at the moment. So too in the lyric from Campion, number 3, part of my aesthetic experience I owe to the individual genius of the poet Campion. Part, on the other hand, and I believe anyone who seriously examines his feelings will reach the same conclusion, is due to something which I will call its Elizabethanness. Needless to say, the phenomenon is not peculiar to the Elizabethan lyric. It is true of other times and places, of the poetry of the Greek anthology, for example, of the French Pléiade, of the English metaphysicals, or of the Cavalier lyric, and it has been well named by some critic joint stock poetry. It arises wherever different poets work together in a kind of coterie or come under the same contemporary influence. In the lyric it is brought out especially strongly when we hear the words set to the music of contemporary composers. And it is always true that if I read or hear too much, if I saturate my imagination with poetry of the same genre, I lose my power to appreciate it as genre, and am thrown back on the achievement, such as it may be, of the individual poet. In such cases, then, we distinguish two separate causes of poetic pleasure, and we are enabled to do this because the realization and contemplation of this joint stock element is itself a third pleasure. It might be compared with the delight which Chaucer took in contemplating the law of kind. Further, our enjoyment of this joint stock element is something in which the producers of the diction in question can have had no share. This was a part of their work, of which they were unconscious, for they were actually living it. 4. Thus, an introspective analysis of my experience obliges me to say that appreciation of poetry involves a felt change of consciousness. The phrase must be taken with some exactness. Appreciation takes place at the actual moment of change. It is not simply that the poet enables me to see with his eyes, and so to apprehend a larger and fuller world. He may indeed do this, as we shall see later, but the actual moment of the pleasure of appreciation depends upon something rarer and more transitory. It depends on the change itself. If I pass a coil of wire between the poles of a magnet, I generate in it an electric current, but I only do so while the coil is positively moving across the lines of force. I may leave the coil at rest between the two poles, and in such a position that it is thoroughly permeated by the magnetic field, but in that case no current will flow along the conductor. Current only flows when I am actually bringing the coil in or taking it away again. So it is with the poetic mood, which, like the dreams to which it has so often been compared, is kindled by the passage from one plane of consciousness to another. It lives during that moment of transition and then dies, and if it is to be repeated, some means must be found of renewing the transition itself. Poetry, as a possession, as our own souls enriched, is another matter. But when it has entered as deeply as that into our being, we no longer concern ourselves with its diction. At this stage the diction has served its end and may be forgotten. For if ever we go back to linger lovingly over the exquisite phrasing of some fragment of poesy whose essence has long been our own, and of which the spirit has become a part of our every waking moment, if we do this, is it not for the very reason that we want to renew the thrill which accompanied the first acquisition of the treasure? As our lips murmur the well-known, or it may be the long-forgotten, words, we are trying, whether deliberately or no, to cast ourselves back into the frame of mind which was ours before we had learnt the lesson. Why? Because we know instinctively that if we are to feel pleasure, we must have change. Everlasting day can no more freshen the earth with dew than everlasting night, but the change from night to day and from day back again to night. That we are not always successful in the wistful quest is matter of only too common experience. Mr. Santayana has expressed with great beauty this sometimes overlooked fact of the rareness of real aesthetic experience. Men are habitually insensible to beauty. Tomes of aesthetic criticism hang on a few moments of real delight and intuition. It is in rare and scattered instance that beauty smiles even on her adorers, who are reduced for habitual comfort to remembering her past favors. An aesthetic glow may pervade experience, but that circumstance is seldom remarked. It figures only as an influence working subterraneously on thoughts and judgments which in themselves take a cognitive or practical direction. Only when the aesthetic ingredient becomes predominant do we exclaim, "How beautiful!" Ordinarily, the pleasures which formal perception gives remain an undistinguished part of our comfort or curiosity. Taste is formed in those moments when aesthetic emotion is massive and distinct. Preferences then grow conscious. Judgments then put into words will reverberate through calmer hours. They will constitute prejudices, habits of apperception, secret standards for all other beauties. A period of life in which such intuitions have been frequent may amass tastes and ideals sufficient for the rest of our days. Youth in these matters governs maturity, and while men may develop their early impressions more systematically and find confirmations of them in various quarters, they will seldom look at the world afresh or use new categories in deciphering it. Half our standards come from our first masters, and the other half from our first loves. Never being so deeply stirred again, we remain persuaded that no objects save those we then discovered can have a true sublimity. Thus the volume and intensity of some appreciations, especially when nothing of the kind has preceded, makes them authoritative over our subsequent judgments. On those warm moments hang all our cold systematic opinions, and while the latter fill our days and shape our careers, it is only the former that are crucial and alive. Is there anybody so fortunate as to be able to dispute the truth in this passage? Yet that precarious element in poetry, which has puzzled critics and poets alike, may at any rate become clearer to us, may even come a little more under our control, if once we can elucidate its causes. And to me the principal cause appears to be that poetic experience depends on a difference of potential, a kind of discrepancy between two moods or modes of consciousness. It is from this point, I take it, that a profitable study of the psychology of aesthetics would diverge. 5. At the end of the last section, a distinction was drawn between poetry as the cause of immediate pleasure, the subject of the 3 preceding sections, and poetry as a possession. What, then, is meant by poetry as a possession? To some extent, in all the examples, but especially in number 5, I am impressed not merely by the difference between my consciousness and the consciousness of which they are the expression, but by something more. I find that in addition to the moment or moments of aesthetic pleasure in appreciation, I gain from them a more permanent boon. It is as though my own consciousness had actually been expanded. In 5a, for example, the image contains so much truth and beauty that henceforth the eyes with which I behold real boats and waves and swans, the ears with which in the right mood I listen to a song, are actually somewhat different. Now, my normal everyday experience, as human being, of the world around me depends entirely on what I bring to the sense datum from within, and the absorption of this metaphor into my imagination has enabled me to bring more than I could before. It has created something in me, a faculty or a part or a faculty enabling me to observe what I could not hitherto observe. This ability to recognize significant resemblances and analogies, considered as in action, I shall call knowledge. Considered as a state, and apart from the effort by which it is imparted and acquired, I shall call it wisdom. The elements in poetic diction which must conduce to it are, as we shall see, metaphor and simile. The use of the word significant will be justified in due course. A little reflection shows that all meaning, even of the most primitive kind, is dependent on the possession of some measure of this power. Where it was wholly absent, the entire phenomenal cosmos must be extinguished. All sounds would fuse into one meaningless roar, all sights into one chaotic panorama, amid which no individual objects, not even color itself, would be distinguishable. Let the reader imagine for a moment that he is standing in the midst of a normal and familiar environment, houses, trees, grass, sky, etc., when suddenly he is deprived by some supernatural stroke of every vestige of memory, and not only of memory, but also of all those assimilated, forgotten experiences, which comprise his power of recognition. He is asked to assume that, in spite of this, he still retains the full measure of his cognitive faculty as an adult. It will appear, I think, that for the first few moments his consciousness, if it can bear that name, will be deprived not merely of all thought, but even of all perception, as we ordinarily understand the word. Footnote. Here, however, called observation, perception being reserved for that element in our reading of the world, which is entirely independent of the understanding. Unless we choose to suppose a certain unimaginable minimum, a kind of panorama of various light, which he will confront with a vacant and uncomprehending state. It is not merely that he will be unable to realize that that square, red, and white object is a house, and to form concepts of an inside with walls and ceilings. He will not even be able to see it as a square, red, and white object. For the most elementary distinctions of form and color are only apprehended by us with the help of the concepts which we have come to unite with the pure sense datum, and these concepts we acquire and fix as we grow up with the help of words, such words as square, red, etc., on the basis of past perceptions, using language as a kind of storehouse. Footnote, the exact relations of cause and effect between language and thought need not be discussed, nor need we at present consider whether the two are indeed absolutely inseparable, as, for example, Locke and Max Müller held. It is enough that for the communication of thought, and of the feelings which thoughts can arouse, and for the storing and public record of them, language is, in fact, the common medium. We gradually build up our ideas, and it is only these, see Chapter 2, Section 2, which enable us to become conscious as human beings of the world around us. There is, therefore, nothing pretentious or dilettante in describing my experience as an expansion of consciousness. 6. While this expansion, knowledge, may remain as something of a permanent possession, wisdom, my aesthetic pleasure will still, in the case under review, only accompany the actual moment of expansion as it before accompanied the moment of change. In fact, as far as the possibility of aesthetic pleasure is concerned, expansion is merely one particular form taken by the necessary change, or movement, and if I wish to repeat the pleasure, I am obliged, as was pointed out, Section 4, to throw myself back into the imaginative content which was mine before I had made these metaphors a part of my meaning of life. To trace out this alternating basis of the poetic mood into further detail, and to strip it of some of its obscurity, it will be necessary to consider, first of all, the nature and history of language itself. Incidentally, this is quite in accord with the traditions of the subject. Dante felt obliged to write at length on the subject of language, and if he, like the Frenchman Du Bellay after him, still regarded it rather from a national point of view, Wordsworth and Shelley showed, in a later age, how a proper study of poetic diction is inseparable from the study of language as a whole. In the infancy of society, wrote Shelley, every author is necessarily a poet, because language itself is poetry. Every original language near to its source is itself the chaos of a cyclic poem. And Wordsworth insisted that the subject could not be determined without pointing out in what manner language and the human mind act and react on each other, and without retracing the revolutions, not of literature alone, but likewise of society itself. Poetry, said Coleridge, is the best words in the best order. In other words, it is the best language. By considering it as such, I hope to mark out a sheet on which it would be possible to plot, to some purpose, the lesser vagaries of English versification. Without some such ground plan, all criticism, all theorizing on the problems of poetic diction, all speculation as to what was or was not beautiful or justifiable in the poetry of the past, and above all attempts to apply such theories to the poetry of the present, must peter out in expressions of personal taste. If my inclination is to skepticism and polite society, I shall exalt Pope and Racine at the expense of Dante and Shelley. If to natural scenery and creative evolution, I shall praise Wordsworth and spit upon Waller. It does not seem unduly arrogant to suggest that criticism is tired of this cat and dog business and needs a little fresh air.